Yeshua came to restore the dynasty of King David. And we see in the very first chapter of Matthew this restoration process taking place. And we see Yeshua, the list there of his ancestors, not his descendants, because he comes forth from the line of David, from Abraham to the Davidic descent. And so the story of Matthew is going to tell us the story of Abraham's people and how they come to fulfillment with a new David in town. I'm Dr. Dina Dye, and welcome to this series, What Did Yeshua Mean? What did Jesus mean? Not what did Jesus do, but what did he mean? And we have been talking quite a bit about, with the backdrop of the book of Matthew. We have covered a lot of ground. And we have just now gotten into Matthew chapter 1, and we have been talking about Yeshua's, his ancestry that is laid out in the first chapter of Matthew. And we see it in three groups of 14 generations until we come to Yeshua the Messiah. And what we have laid out here is the seed, the continuing seed of the dynasty of King David from Abraham all the way to Yeshua the Messiah. And it is the long road, if you will, of the story of Abraham's people that comes to fulfillment in what we would say is the new David, Yeshua ben David, Jesus the son of David. And he has come now in the same way that kings were responsible to save their people from foreign enemies that would come against them, foreign empires. Now we see one, Yeshua, who's come to save his people from their sins, because a comparison has been made between how world leaders and tyrants, people like the Pharaoh and kings of Babylon and the kings of Assyria like Sennacherib or Tiglath-Pileser, the goal of the leader of an empire is to oppress and bring their people down and enslave them. And so sin, the results of sin are compared to what tyrants do to people, and the way they oppress you and take away your freedom and prevent you from being prosperous and blessed in your life. That's what sin does. So sin kind of looks like a world empire tyrant, and it enslaves you, and it doesn't let you go, and you are not free to be prosperous, to be flourishing in your life. So if we go back to the first century, we find that in essence, the Jews of that time still saw themselves as slaves in exile under pagan rule. Now we know they came back to the land. Remember King Cyrus of Persia, who issued the decree and allowed the Jews to return to the land. Of course, they all didn't go, but those who were able, we see Nehemiah and Ezra, etc., to go back. And what's the first thing they're supposed to do is to build the temple, build a house for the presence of God. And in that, they're building a temple for the throne of the king, except that their king their line of their king got lost in all of this. And so even though they came back and they built a temple, and it wasn't anything like the former temple, Solomon's temple, and over time we see the Hasmonean rulers and the Herodian rulers, etc., and they're back in the land, and they have this king who isn't really the legitimate king. The Jews still see themselves in exile, just like they were in Babylon, because now, even though they're in the land, they have a standing temple, the kingship's a little bit in question. They are living under pagan rule. They are living under Roman rule. They are living under the rule of the Caesars. So not much has changed. So back to Matthew chapter 1, and we had, in our last show, we kind of made a comparison between Matthew 1:1 and Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It's speaking of a covenant being made between the heavens and earth that would produce something, which we'll talk about in a second. And that covenant made with God, the heavens and the earth joining together with God himself. Now we see the Genesis, the book of the Genesis and the ancestry here of Yeshua the Messiah in Matthew 1:1. And there's a very interesting word that as we go through the genealogy, remember we have got 3 sections of 14 generations, and we see, focus in on Abraham, for example, that Abraham begot Isaac. And that special word in there is toledot, which means to bring forth children, okay, to bear children. That yalad is a word we get for a male child. So toledot means to bring forth children. So Abraham brings forth children, Isaac. Isaac begat, or toledot, Jacob. Jacob begot toledot, Judah, and the brothers. And on from there, Jacob begot Joseph, the husband of Miriam. We've gone way far from the beginning. From whom was born Yeshua, who is called the Messiah. So this language of toledot, to bring forth or to bear children, actually, again, we're going to see a pattern of this in Genesis chapter 1 moving into Genesis chapter 2. And if we go to Genesis 2:1 and into from 2:1 to 2:4, it will say, these are the genealogical records. The Hebrew word there is toledot. So these are the children that are born of the heavens and the earth when they were created at the time when Adonai Elohim made the earth and the heavens. So I have talked quite a bit about how important it is to ask lots and lots of questions. That we have arrived at a time in the 21st century leading up to this where we don't even know how to ask questions or what questions to ask, because we dutifully sit in front of whomever is standing before us and telling us what to think. And so one of the great tragedies of our time is the loss of critical thinking skills. And you develop critical thinking skills by asking lots of questions to help make sense of the material that you're looking at. So we don't even know how to ask questions. But the question that you should ask when you read this is, how on earth does the heavens and the earth bear children? That doesn't even make sense, okay? So these are the toldot, or the children that come forth, or the children that are born of the heavens and the earth when they were created. Again, we go back to Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So something is being produced by the unity between heaven and earth. Now, in the ancient world, what the ancients always built a temple on top of a mountain, and we're going to talk about more in some future sessions. But they'd have a mountain. On top of the mountain, they would build a temple. The temple on top of the mountain would be the seat of government. The temple in any of these cultures was the place where heaven and earth came together. So you have the heavens, you have the earth, and where they joined together would be where the temple was, on top of the mountain. So if you were going up a mountain, it was as though you were entering into heaven. So that sphere, that unity, was at the place where heaven and earth were joined. And so the heavens came to represent the gods, if you will, and then by extension his king, who would sit on the throne in the temple that was on top of the mountain. And the uniting of heaven and earth had to do with kingship, because a king, before he sat in his throne in the temple, which represented heaven, he was a mortal man. So, for example, we could talk about King David. You remember when God was going to raise up and anoint one from his family, and he had, he was the 8th out of 7, and they went through each kid, and then God put his anointing on David. Well, David's father was not God at that point. We don't know who his mother was, but David was of earthly descent. His father and mother were mortal humans that gave birth to him. And then he was going to be raised up by God to become king. And in the process of the enthronement, he went from being mortal to becoming divine. So when he went to the top of the mountain, sat in the temple and in the throne room and sat on the throne, he was raised up to become divine. So this unity between heaven and earth has to do with kingship. As a king was raised up from the earth or from mortality to become divine in the temple in heaven. So when the king bore fruit, when his son would inherit the throne, we call those the sons of God. So this language in Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis 2, the bearing of children that would come forth from the heavens and the earth, speaks of kingship. And then we fast forward to Matthew chapter 1, and we see the Genesis. Matthew is the book of the Genesis of Yeshua the Messiah, son of David, is the matchup to that, bringing forth the son who would be called the sons of God. And so this in Genesis 2:4 is the very first use of this word toledot, to bear children, to bring forth children. And again, the point of this is speaking about kingship and the unity of heaven and earth. If we go back to this idea of being born again, also has to do with kingship. That a man would be born of earthly parents, and then he would be born again of heavenly parents. So his father before him, the king, would be the divine royal king, and he would now become that king's adopted son. Whether he was the natural son or not, he would be the adopted son of the divine king. I really hope that makes sense, because that's how the ancient world looked at this stuff. And so I've told you that the book of Matthew should be read through the eyes of the Exodus. We have a lot of Exodus language in it, and we're going to see that as we continue to go through. But one of the things we find is in the opening pages of the book of Exodus is you remember the children of Israel are suffering under Pharaoh, the tyrant. They got to make bricks without straw. We see that the Pharaoh's worried that they're going to have too many children, and so now the midwives, this is a replay of what we have with Yeshua and Herod. And so he's got to get rid of all the baby boys, because one of them could be king and upset the apple cart. So the beginning of Exodus, we see there's a midrash on Exodus that says that all beginnings are hard. So we have the beginning of Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created heavens and earth. We have the beginning of the book of Matthew, the Genesis of Matthew, Yeshua, the Messiah, coming forth. So this idea of the difficulty of coming forth, that beginnings are hard, and within the idea of beginnings, we're suffering and difficulty and the labor of birth. So bringing forth new life to bear children was understood to be hard, to be difficult. And so the bringing forth of new life and the royal line of the sons of God was difficult. And so this language of kingship and difficulty and suffering all kind of encompassed in this. So the king was the one who would begat the son, who would be the heir to the throne, who would be called the Son of God. For in the ancient world, every son of the king was called the Son of God or the adopted Son of God. Or sometimes he would be called the one and only, begotten, same word as toledot, son. So that's quite a mouthful. Just in looking at Matthew chapter 1 is all encompassed in there. So I would posit that Genesis chapter 1, and now again we see in Matthew 1:1, the idea of heaven and earth joining together to produce life has everything to do with covenant language. It is language of the unity of two entities. And when two entities come together in a covenant, they produce. There is prosperity, there is fruitfulness that comes forth, just as in a marriage. When two come together, the whole point of it is to recreate, to create children, to produce fruit. And as I mentioned that in the ancient world, the suzerain or the king, he would make a covenant with his vassal. The idea of that would be a picture of heaven and earth coming together, as the suzerain represented heaven in the temple on top of the mountain, and the vassal represented earth. So when the two came together in a covenant, they produced some kind of fruit. Something would be born. You could have the same thing with a king and his son, who the picture was of the king and his servant, the father and son. When the king and his servant, or the father and his son, made a covenant, they produced new life. And of course, that new life would be the new heir to the throne. So, again, to repeat, the domain of kings and gods was heaven. The domain of men was earth. And the idea of making a covenant between heaven and earth was the same, if you will, as making a covenant between the king and his servant and between the father and his son. And so when these two came together, the union of those two produced heirs. The king and the servant would produce the throne, the heir to the throne, who would be raised up. And the kings, of course, we know, ruled over men from heaven. That's just the way the ancient people described it, okay? We look at it and we just talk about, there's this building over there, and inside the building is a throne, and the king sits on the throne. And the building is in a high place because that makes the most sense. But see, their world, they're describing all these things, that the top of the mountain was in the image of heaven, and the bottom of the mountain would be earth. And this joining together of people in covenant, that's just the way they described it. And so we don't think like that. We think in scientific terms where when we look at heaven, we don't think of it as a sphere for the king in his domain. We think of, the sky and what's up in there and clouds and stars, and we're looking at it in only scientific terms. It's not that the ancients didn't understand science, it's not the way they described things. So that's very important. Now, I mentioned in what's very interesting in Matthew chapter 1 is we have house building going on here. So from Abraham to David, we are building a house. We are building a dynasty until we come to Yeshua. And of course, behind every good king, every good man is a woman. But we only have 5 women listed in that royal dynasty, which is 42 generations, if you will. And it doesn't turn out to be exactly 42, but as it's counted in the scripture, there's 3 groups of 14, which comes out to 42. And I don't want to get too outside the box here, but I just would point your attention to, do you remember when the children of Israel went through the wilderness? Do you remember how many stations there were when they crossed the sea and they're traveling through the wilderness with the tabernacle? They go through 42 stations. That's not by accident, okay? Again, I remind you that the book of Matthew is related to the book of Exodus. Whatever's going on in Exodus, you're going to find a similar story, albeit it might be embellished. It might have a different dimension to it. The writer might have a different interpretation of it, but it's basically telling us the same story. And so we see in this genealogy here, the Toledot of Yeshua, that Judah begot Perez and Zerah, and the woman that's mentioned there is Tamar. As we're going through this, I want you to see if you can figure out what is similar about all these women. So Salmon begot Boaz by someone named Rahab. Then Boaz begot Oved by Ruth. David begat Solomon by his wife, the wife of Uriah. No mention. She doesn't even get her name mentioned, which is very interesting as well. And Jacob begot Joseph, the husband of Miriam. So we have Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, the wife of Uriah, and Miriam, the husband, Miriam, the final Yeshua's mother. So we have in this the royal line from Adam to the second Adam, if you will. Tamar, her name means royal date palm. She represents the tree. Rahab means broad or wide, and you remember the broad wall out of where Rahab lived. Ruth means a friend or a companion. The wife of Uriah is Bat-sheva, which means daughter of seven or house of seven. And Miriam actually means one who is rebellious or bitter. Now, you ask, why these 5 women? Why were these 5 women placed into this story here? And this is a question you need to ask, that they're part of the dynasty of King David. So women weren't normally listed in the genealogies anciently. So right there you got to go, okay, Houston, we got a problem. Why do we have these 5 women listed? Interestingly enough, that these women are all of quote-unquote Gentile descent, and they were noted to be, in some way, harlots or prostitutes, that they were from outside the camp of Israel. And so outside the camp of Israel was a place of shame, and yet they brought honor to all of Israel from outside the camp, from the place of exile, if you will. These women brought honor. They brought forth the royal line of the dynasty of King David. And Miriam, Yeshua's mother, fulfills the role of all of these women who are outside the mainstream, the ones who brought shame and not necessarily, in the eyes of the world, but honor to the royal line of King David. And so it's quite, again, we ask ourselves the question that there is a looking forward then to the unity of 2 camps between the Jewish, the ideal, and between the non-Jew. And Matthew, again, the point of the book of Matthew was to show us the unity between these 2 groups in the first century. And so the writer putting this in there is making that statement as well, as that there is a unity to come, and that this line doesn't look anything like the royal lines of world empires, and how that this line contains within it an element of shame, but yet is raised up to be that of honor. So it's very significant. I'm telling you, the details in the stories are going to tell us something about how Yeshua fulfills the role of Israel and what God is trying to do through Israel and the statements that he is trying to make through this. So we see that Tamar plays the harlot in order to join with Judah, the son of Jacob. Rahav was the one who hid the spies, if you'll remember. Ruth, the Moabitess, is the one. She married Boaz. We see that in the line of David. And we see the wife of Uriah, Bathsheba, who was seduced, of course, by David. And then Miriam, who becomes pregnant before marriage. So what a lineup. So there was, accusations against that Miriam, for example, by the temple leadership, the corrupt leadership. Because all of this, in essence, goes back to the idea this is a subversive act to have these women in the genealogy. This goes against everything. And we remember that Miriam, we aren't 100% sure, but there was a special or a very unspecial ceremony in the first century that a woman who was caught in the act of adultery had to go through this absolutely shameless ceremony on top of the temple, at the temple. And it is quite like, it was called the Sotah. And again, a woman who was caught in adultery had to go through this, expose her nakedness, and she had to drink this mixture of water and dirt from the place in the temple. They mixed it together, and then if her belly swole up, they would kill the baby. I mean, it was just brutal that she had to do this in front of everyone. And so it's just very interesting that she likely had to go through that ceremony. And so I would just, I can't emphasize enough this idea of this sort of subversive act to have these 5 women who are all seen as a type of harlot or prostitute in the line of King David going back from Abraham. This is making a very big statement towards world empire, that this is again a subversive act, and that Yeshua's line works in complete opposition to how the world functions, to where, if you weren't of royal blood all the way through blue blood, you were not going to be taking the throne unless, of course, you conquered another empire. So it's very exciting, even in the first chapter of Matthew, how we see that this imagery is being played out. So we're going to pick it up here next time. Hopefully this is making sense to you. And again, we're trying to go through the book of Matthew, and we're trying to see it through the eyes of the Exodus and how Yeshua walked the same way that Israel did in the Exodus under Pharaoh. And now we're seeing it replayed. See you next time. Shalom.